LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I picked out 27 of the weekend's best clips for what should be a really good show for you today. As usual, my clips come mostly from the Sunday morning news analysis shows. Actually, all from the Sunday morning news analysis shows this week. The big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States. As for the political comedy, I like to sprinkle in no Bill Maher for one more week and no Saturday Night Live till next fall, but I will try to find at least a slightly comedic moment from the straight news broadcast to start the show. You can see all the topics I'm covering listed down in the video description, and if you're watching this as a recorded show, you should see time indexes down there to skip to the topics that most interest you. Today's topics include the growing field of Republican candidates running for president, this week with clips from Jeb Bush, Dr. Ben Carson, Governor Bobby Jindal, George Pataki, Governor John Kasich, and Carly Fiorina. I'll also have a quick clip on China's land grab in the South China Sea. About half the clips for the show will actually be on the Patriot Act and bulk phone record collection and NSA spying, because the Patriot Act is set to expire at midnight tonight. That's in less than 2 hours from when I'm broadcasting the show right now. And I also have a quick clip at the end on this weird indictment of former Republican Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert. But first I want to start with a couple clips each from Hillary Clinton's announced Democratic challengers, former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley and current independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. Now, regarding Bernie Sanders, I've seen a bunch of outlets characterizing his democratic socialist views as far out, but maybe none as far out as Chuck Todd on Meet the Press this morning, which for some reason found it necessary to associate Bernie Sanders with UFOs. Well, not really, but kind of, as you can see over in this clip.
And we are back. If you believe some people, the race for the Democratic nomination, over. Hillary Clinton has it won. But as our colleague Tom Brokaw likes to say, there's always the theory of UFOs, unforeseen occurrences. Yesterday, former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley announced his candidacy, and before him came Bernie Sanders of Vermont. And he just might be the kind of UFO we've seen in the past.
But we are going to build a movement of millions of Americans.
Could a rumpled 73-year-old self-described socialist become Hillary Clinton's most dangerous political opponent? He may not be a packaged candidate, but Bernie Sanders has a powerful weapon. He can puncture Clinton's aura of inevitability simply by beating expectations.
I don't look upon this campaign principally as one in which you are trying to pick up delegates.
In 1968, Eugene McCarthy mobilized a volunteer army of students who flooded into New Hampshire, shaving their beards to get clean for Gene. McCarthy's surprise second-place finish with 42% of the vote was a stunning repudiation of President Lyndon Johnson and his Vietnam policy.
It changes the political picture in America for 1968.
McCarthy's upset drew then-Senator Bobby Kennedy into the Democratic race, and it pushed Johnson out. In 1984, it was little-known Senator Gary Hart who beat expectations and finished second in Iowa.
I think it means I'm going to be president.
To then go on to New Hampshire and stun Walter Mondale, beating him by 10 points.
Boy, did New Hampshire come up with a surprising finish tonight.
Hart's candidacy later collapsed, but his victory exposed weakness in Mondale. In November, Ronald Reagan carried 49 of 50 states. In 2012, Mitt Romney beat Rick Santorum, but he never recovered from Santorum's bruising. Now, a populist insurgent is poised to become the latest protest vehicle, pushing Hillary Clinton to the left and potentially exposing vulnerabilities that could help Republicans in the fall.
Now, I thought that was an interesting analysis, especially the analogy to Eugene McCarthy and the way he opened the way for Robert Kennedy to enter the race when he showed the weakness of Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, who ended up not running for re-election. And I suppose something like that could happen with Elizabeth Warren. That's what I've heard some people say anyway, that if Bernie Sanders or Martin O'Malley shows enough weakness in Hillary Clinton, that Elizabeth Warren might get in like in October or something. But I don't think that's very likely. As I've said on the show before, I think Elizabeth Warren is actually going to run for president not in 2016, but in some later year. And I do think that Bernie Sanders is going to have something of a groundswell. I mean, he's going to show some weakness in Hillary Clinton, and he's going to, get unexpectedly good results. And that's one of the points that they were making on Meet the Press. Even though they did that whole UFO thing, they were actually talking about how he might do better than everyone thinks. And one reason is because he's very authentic, while Hillary Clinton has been kind of moving to the left as she's contemplating running for president again. And that's something Chuck Todd brought up when he had his interview with Bernie Sanders. And I want to show you that clip, and you'll see that Chuck Todd is actually trying to get Bernie Sanders to attack Hillary Clinton, and he just won't do it over in this clip.
It's interesting when you watch your chief primary opponent right now, Secretary Hillary Clinton, on some key issues. She has changed her position to a more progressive view on same-sex marriage, on immigration. This is over the last 10 years, on NAFTA, on trade, on the Iraq War, on Cuba. She has moved from a position basically in disagreement with you to a position that comes closer to your view. So I guess do you take her at her word, and do you think that rhetorically that's enough?
Well, look, I have known Hillary Clinton for 25 years. I have enormous respect for her, and I like her. And what I hope, Chuck, is that the media will allow us to have a serious debate in this campaign on the enormous issues facing the American people, which is why for the last 40 years, our middle class has been disappearing, why 99% of all new income generated today is going to the top 1%, and why we have this grotesque level of income and wealth inequality. I know a lot of people criticize me. In Vermont, they say, oh, Bernie, you've been saying the same thing for 30 years. Well, it's kind of true. And maybe it's, maybe it's a badge of honor. But I have been there. I think we need a political revolution in this country. I think we need to take on the greed of the billionaire class, a disastrous campaign finance system.
So that's Bernie Sanders again, focusing on the issues, not wanting to attack Hillary Clinton. And I don't think that we're going to get a lot of negative attacks on Hillary Clinton from Bernie Sanders, as I showed in previous weeks, where he said he's never run a negative campaign and he's not going to start now. There was a little more negativity against Hillary Clinton from Martin O'Malley. He's the former governor of Maryland who announced that he's running. But the fact that he was mayor of Baltimore and is responsible for some of the over-policing there, even though he's a Democrat, I think that's a real problem for him. And that was one of the issues that George Stephanopoulos brought up in his interview of Martin O'Malley on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning over in this clip.
It could be a double-edged sword. Everyone's been focused on the issues in Baltimore coming out of the recent unrest. And you were mayor of Baltimore for 8 years, big drop in crime, but a lot of your critics say your tenure also sowed the seeds of distrust between the police and the community. I was struck by something the former head of the Baltimore NAACP told the Baltimore Sun. He said Martin O'Malley is going around Baltimore as his claim to fame. I think this should be his greatest embarrassment.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? For all of the progress that we make, there's always so much more that needs to be done. I would not have been elected with 91% of the vote the first time, or re-elected 4 years later with 88% of the vote, if we were not making substantial progress. When I was elected in 1999, George, our city had become the most violent and addicted and abandoned city in America. It was a huge challenge. But we went on in the next 10 years to achieve the biggest reduction of Part 1 crime of any city in America. And now the city's population is growing again, with greater numbers of young people moving back here than before. But it's also true that we have huge pockets of poverty in our city and in other cities in the United States. And the anger that erupted in our city happened in some of the poorest, hardest hit neighborhoods where unemployment's actually higher now than it was 7 years ago. I'd be angry too. The poet once wrote that the unemployment in our bones erupts in our hands in stones. We can do better as a country, and we can't leave behind so many that are underemployed or unemployed or earning less than they were 12 years ago.
No, I don't really buy Martin O'Malley's answer there that the problems in Baltimore just means that even though he made progress, there's always more progress to make, because he had this zero tolerance policing that created a lot of the distrust and over policing in Baltimore that's led to this violence and like I said, distrust between the community and the police. So I don't. I mean, I actually seem to. I like Bernie Sanders more than Martin O'Malley based on what I've seen so far. Though I don't think either of them are really posing a serious threat to Hillary Clinton. But Martin O'Malley, like I said, at least was willing to go negative on Hillary a little bit and on her closeness to Wall Street, which is one of the concerns I have about Hillary Clinton. And I'm not going to show the whole interview with Martin O'Malley. There's a link down to This Week with George Stephanopoulos in the video description. But Martin O'Malley would not go negative on Hillary about the emails. He wouldn't even go negative on her about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But he was willing to sort of go negative on her in terms of her closeness to Wall Street. And this includes a clip of him in his announcement speech that George Stephanopoulos asked him about this morning here.
In your speech today, you had some tough words for Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton.
The CEO of Goldman Sachs let his employees know that he'd be just fine with either Bush or Clinton. I bet he would. Well, I've got news for the bullies of Wall Street. The presidency is not a crown to be passed back and forth by you between two royal families.
Are you saying that both Bush and Clinton are beholden to the bullies of Wall Street?
I'm saying that what we need new leadership to accomplish is to actually rein in excesses on Wall Street. And when you have somebody that's the CEO of one of the biggest repeat and offending investment banks in the country telling his employees that he'd be fine with either Bush or Clinton, that should tell all of us something.
You don't see a difference?
Do I see a difference? Sure, I see many differences. But one of the most important differences when it comes to reining in Wall Street is who's on our side. I have the independence. I have the track record.
You think Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush would have the same approach to Wall Street?
I don't know what Secretary Clinton's approach to Wall Street might be. She will run her own campaign and I will run mine. I can tell you this, I am not beholden to Wall Street interests. There are not Wall Street CEOs banging down my door and trying to participate or help my campaign.
I mean, that's a good talking point, but like I said, I'm kind of worried about Martin O'Malley as a challenger in terms of, I just don't think he's that great a challenger because of what's happened in Baltimore and his responsibility for some of the policies that led to that. And anyway, that's the 4 clips I want to play on the Democratic side of the presidential race. There's still like 500 days to the election, but it's heating up, and especially on the Republican side. The next clip I want to show, it starts off with, this is from NBC's, no, sorry, this is also from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. George Stephanopoulos talks about all the new entrants into the race, and then he had Dr. Ben Carson on and asked him about specifically how Rand Paul is kind of sticking out amongst the Republican field by blaming ISIS on Republican hawks, and pretty much everyone in the party has attacked him on that, and Ben Carson was no exception. After which you can see after you watch this clip, like I said, it starts with an introduction about who the new entrants are, and then goes to Ben Carson here.
In this week's Buzzboard, 2 new candidates for the GOP. Ready to do this again.
I'm a candidate for the Republican nomination for President of the United States.
And after their announcements, Rick Santorum edges out George Pataki in our Facebook Centimeter. The packed field bunched at the top. Bush, Carson, Huckabee, Rubio, and Walker in a 5-way tie. And Rand Paul did his best to break from the pack with this surprising shot at fellow Republicans.
ISIS exists and grew stronger because of the hawks in our party who gave arms indiscriminately, and most of those arms were snatched up by ISIS.
And we are joined now by another official candidate, Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Carson, thank you for joining us this morning. What did you make of those comments by Rand Paul blaming Republicans for the growth of ISIS?
That certainly would not be my take on it. I believe that, we kind of stirred things up when we went in there, but we stirred them up even worse when we left there and left an unstable situation.
Yeah, you have.
That's pretty much a ridiculous analysis from Dr. Ben Carson that we stirred things up less by going into Iraq and deposing Saddam Hussein than we stirred things up when we left Iraq. That just seems silly to me. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. But I want to move on to the next Republican who may be running for president, who was also on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. This is Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, and he was much harsher in his attacks on Senator Rand Paul, and you can see that response here.
You heard Ben Carson on Rand Paul. You were even tougher on Senator Paul this week, saying it's impossible to imagine a President Paul defeating radical Islam. If that's the case, will you refuse to support Rand Paul if he's your party's nominee?
George, thank you for having me this morning. Look, I don't think it's going to come to that. I don't think he will be our party's nominee. I wasn't surprised to hear a presidential candidate want to continue the failed foreign policies of President Obama. I was just surprised it was a Republican. Listen to what he said. He said that ISIS exists because of foreign policy hawks in the Republican Party. George, that's nonsense. ISIS is evil. ISIS exists because of radical Islam. It's radical Islamic terrorism. Nobody in America is to blame for the existence of ISIS. That is reckless. That is almost bizarre rhetoric coming from somebody who's auditioning to be commander-in-chief.
And what we
I don't know. Does anyone really take Bobby Jindal seriously as a presidential candidate? He used to say that the Republicans have to stop being the stupid party, and then he's like gone all in on the stupid, it seems to me. But you can let me know, not necessarily in that answer. The problem is that you can't blame ISIS and on the Democrats alone, and the fight against radical Islam that. I've talked about that many times, but I actually want to move on to CBS's Face the Nation, where Bob Schieffer had his last broadcast after 24 years as the host of Face the Nation and 50-something years as a reporter for CBS. And I guess that's why former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, who some people think is the heavyweight frontrunner for the Republican nomination, he agreed to do an interview with Bob Schieffer. And I want to show a couple clips from that in this section, and then there'll be one later in the Patriot Act section. But first, here's Jeb Bush talking about how he is not going to flip-flop. He's going to hold on to his positions even if it loses him the primary, or what he meant when he said that several months ago over in this clip.
Last year, you said, and I'm going to quote you, anyone running for president should be prepared to, quote, lose the primary to win the general election without violating your principles. What hot-button issues would you be willing to separate yourself from, say, the right wing of your party to carry out that philosophy?
Yeah, now, when I said that, I don't mean I'm going to go out of my way to lose the primary, because then you have no chance of winning the general. But the simple point is, I think people are so disaffected and so cynical about politicians and politics, they don't want to hear someone say, well, I'm for this now, and then immediately shift back to another position for the general election. Those days, if they ever existed, are over. So I have views that are different than some in our party, and that's what we'll sort out. If I'm a candidate, I'll go. Well, I'm not going to back down on views on immigration, for example. I think we have an immigration problem. It's a system that's broken. The legal system is broken. We need to narrow family petitioning and expand economic immigrants. We need to enforce the law. And we can't keep having this be a political issue when we're missing the opportunity to create high growth that everybody could benefit from.
Well, let me just ask you about that. You have said in the past that you do support a path for legal citizenship and residency for the 11 million people here in this country that are here illegally. A lot of your opponents say that's amnesty.
Right.
Do you still favor a path to citizenship for these people?
I'm for a path to legalized status, where people get a provisional work permit, where they pay taxes, pay a fine, learn English, don't commit crimes, don't receive federal government assistance, and where they earn legal status. They don't earn citizenship. They don't cut in line with people that have been patiently waiting on the outside. That, it seems to be a fair system. But those that are opposed to that or call that amnesty don't have a plan really to deal with the 11 million people that are here illegally.
Now, that actually is kind of a flip-flop from Jeb Bush there, because he did used to favor a path to citizenship, and what he's talking about there is a path to legal status, and that is not really a great policy where you let people work in your country but have no way of becoming citizens and full participants in your society and your political all your political campaigns, and can't participate politically, and that means you basically end up with second-class citizens. This happens a lot in the some of the Arab oil countries where they bring in workers who, even though sometimes they will have multiple generations. They have families there, but they never become citizens, and though a lot of them are just workers who come and then go back to their countries, and they treat them really badly, and they have no chance of ever being citizens, and I don't really like that immigration policy. But the real problem for Jeb Bush, I think, is his brother, George W. Bush. You remember a couple weeks back, Jeb had some real problems distancing himself from his brother's policy on Iraq, and I'm going to show a clip of Bob Schieffer asking him specifically about his brother, and this is after Bob Schieffer actually talked to George W. Bush, and Jeb Bush used a term that it took me a while to figure out what he meant. He said that he had to Heisman his brother, which I guess the Heisman Trophy has like a hand sticking out, and so it's like pushing someone away is Heismaning them, or doing the Heisman on them. And here's Jeb Bush talking about how he hates to have to do that to his brother in this clip.
Let me ask you, I've talked to your brother a couple of times over the last year, and he's very candid. He says one of the problems that you're going to have is him. And he says you cannot let the campaign become about him.
Right.
Do you think he's your main challenge?
No, I don't. This is hard for me, to be honest with you. I have to do the Heisman on my brother that I love. This is not something I'm comfortable doing, but I'm my own person. I have my own life experience, and I will be successful if I'm a candidate when I share my heart and talk about what I've done as governor of the state, where I cut taxes, reduced the state government workforce by 11%, moved the state to a AAA bond rating. I mean, they called me Vito Corleone because I believe that government income should grow far less than personal income, which grew at 4.5% during my time. As I tell that story, people will begin to say, yeah, look, he's a Bush. That's fine, but I'm for him because he has ideas that will help me rise up. And so my brother's not going to be a problem at all. I seek out his advice. I love him dearly. I've learned from his successes and his mistakes.
And Bob Schieffer then goes on to ask him how he's learned from his brother's mistakes, and I'm not going to show you that clip because I want to move on to NBC's Meet the Press, where they had a couple possible Republican candidates on. First, Rick Santorum, who just announced he's running for president, and Chuck Todd had a question for him about why. First, he showed the Iowa poll numbers, which actually show Scott Walker in the lead. This is, Iowa has the first caucus, and then he asked Rick Santorum, since he won Iowa in 2012, why he's doing so poorly in Iowa now, and you can see his answer over here.
Going with the press. And by the way, we have some new numbers on the race from the latest Des Moines Register Bloomberg poll of Iowa caucus goers in that important first state of Iowa. Scott Walker tops the field with 17%. The next four, Rand Paul, Ben Carson in double digits. Jeb Bush and Mike Huckabee just below that, bunched together, followed by Marco Rubio and Rick Santorum, the winner of the caucuses in 12. The rest of the field trails even further behind. Ted Cruz is leading the second tier there at 5. In a moment, I'll talk to John Kasich, who's down at just 2% in this Iowa poll. But first up is former Senator Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania, the last man standing against Mitt Romney in 2012. Senator Santorum, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you, Chuck.
Well, I got to start with, you're at 6% in a poll of Iowa caucus goers in a state that you won 4 years ago. How do you not look at that and say, geez, I probably have 100% name ID with likely Iowa caucus goers, and I'm in single digits? Are you concerned that you don't have the same support or strength of support that you did 4 years ago?
Well, all I can say is that we have a tremendous group of volunteers there. In fact, we signed up 100 volunteers just this week online, which brings our total to well over 500 across the state. I didn't announce until after that poll, and you know, we've been sort of not in front of the TV for a long time, 3 years, where I was off providing for my family and you know, making money to send kids to college. So we just announced this week, and we'll wait and see how those polls look as the months go on.
So I don't know if that is a really reasonable answer to the question why he's not a front runner when he won Iowa last time. The fact that hasn't been on TV and he's been off making money. That, I mean, he had, like Chuck Todd said, he has very high name recognition. But it is still early. There could still be a lot of movement in before we actually get to the Iowa vote, which is what, in January 2016. And I want to show another clip from Meet the Press. This is Chuck Todd talking to John Kasich of Ohio, who has not announced yet, but is one of the people who looks like he might be running for president. And Ohio, of course, is a very important state. And I want to show how John Kasich answered a question about the death penalty. You know, last week I had a couple clips at the end of the show about how Nebraska looked like it was going to get rid of the death penalty. Well, it actually did. The legislature overrode the veto from the governor, and Nebraska got rid of the death penalty, and that's right next to Ohio. So Chuck Todd asked John Kasich about it, and I think he made a couple really bogus arguments about the death penalty that I'll talk about after you see that clip over here.
Something about that happened this week in another Midwestern state. The state of Nebraska decided to stop the death penalty altogether. And there's different reasons why they did it. You have had a temporary moratorium in Ohio. I want to read you something that a former predecessor of yours wrote recently. Bob Taft wrote this in December of last year. The death penalty is very costly to administer. Lengthy trial and appellate procedures put a burden on county and state governments to pay for lawyers, judges, and jails. It may be time to ask the question whether the death penalty in Ohio is a dead man walking. Do you agree with his assessment that basically the death penalty is done in Ohio?
No, I don't agree with that, Chuck. Look, we're just looking for the drugs that we need to administer it. And in this debate, sometimes we forget the victims. Listen, I review all these cases, and some people I've said we will let them stay for a life in prison if I wasn't certain of who did what. But I've had these grieving families come to see me, Chuck, people who've had their mothers who have been gunned down. And look, it's about justice, and it isn't about revenge, it's about justice. And I support the death penalty and will continue to do that because a lot of times families want closure when they see justice done. We're in a tricky situation here because of the lack of drugs, but no, I think you administer it sparingly. But frankly, at the end of the day, when it comes to me, everybody's had a look at these cases, and I get the final say. And I try to remember, I don't try to, I remember the victims when I consider this.
And I know.
Well, the victims argument is bogus because not all victims or family members of murder victims are pro-death penalty. I've made a video on that a long time ago about how my local newspaper covered it that way, and it just wasn't true. In fact, here in California, where the ACLU's done a lot of work to try to limit and get rid of the death penalty, there is a group called California Crime Victims for Justice or Against the Death Penalty, or I can't remember the name of the group exactly, but there's a large number of California crime victims and family members of murder victims who are against the death penalty. And that idea of closure, I think actually life in prison as a sentence gives more closure to the family because it's much less appealable, it's a much more final sentence, while the death penalty, it just drags on. There are mandatory appeals, and it drags on, and at least here in California, in many states, people on death row are more likely to die of old age or violence in prison than to actually be given the death penalty. So the closure argument is just as bogus as the victim argument. I want to show one more clip on the Republican field, and this is another kind of bogus clip. This is Fox News Sunday interviewing Carly Fiorina, who is the Republican woman in the race, the only woman on the Republican side, although I guess there's only one woman on the Democratic side as well, Hillary Clinton. And what's bogus about this clip, Carly Fiorina said this really kind of racist thing about the Chinese recently, and Chris Wallace at least is confrontational enough to ask her about it, but he never really mentions that it's racist, and she kind of weasels out of it without ever mentioning the racist aspect of this question. It's about the Chinese and whether we can compete against the Chinese, and that's the last clip I want to show on the Republican field of presidential candidates over here.
And I'm going to ask you the 501st question. You oppose Common Core education standards, and one of your reasons for that has gotten some blowback. Here it is.
The argument for Common Core is frequently, oh, we have to compete with the Chinese. I've been doing business in China for decades, and I will tell you that, yeah, the Chinese can take a test, but what they can't do is innovate. They're not terribly imaginative, they're not entrepreneurial, they don't innovate. That's why they're stealing our intellectual property.
But the fact is, China is on track to lead the world in science and technology research by 2019. And more important, the U.S. now ranks 30th in math literacy in the world and 20th in reading literacy. Question, aren't we falling behind, not just China, but the rest of the world when it comes to education?
Well, of course, our education system is a big problem. The point I was trying to make about the Chinese is the system that they have put in place standardizes behavior. It is part of the repression of that regime. It's one of the reasons why China, for example, has a strategy of continuing to steal our intellectual property. It's one of the reasons why they have not adhered to the requirements of WTO. Our education system is in trouble, but demonstrably, giving more money to the Department of Education, as we have been doing for almost 40 years, doesn't improve the state of education. But Common Core has become, however it was intended originally, Common Core has become a nationally driven set of bureaucratic standards that teach teachers how to teach, that teach children how to learn, and what we need is to provide more parental choice so that our kids, anywhere they live, have a real chance, and Common Core doesn't help us do that.
Oh my God, God forbid that we teach teachers how to teach or children how to learn, but I guess national standard isn't the way to do that. But like I said, I think what's really kind of bogus about that clip is Chris Wallace starts off kind of confrontational, showing the quote from Carly Fiorina that was pretty racist against the Chinese, like kind of stereotypical, saying that they can't innovate. But then he never really said it was racist, and he let her kind of weasel out of the racist aspect of it, talking more about Common Core and about how well students do in math. And anyway, that's the last clip I want to show on the Republican field of candidates. Excuse me, I have a kind of a cold the last couple days. I took Sudafed, but it's kind of in my chest now, so excuse me for that. But I want to show one quick clip on something that China is doing that actually is more threatening. It's this land grab in the South China Sea, and I only have one clip on it, but it's CNN's Jim Sciutto actually went on a P-8 Poseidon spy plane. It can also be an anti-submarine plane, as he explains in this clip I'm about to show. And the military really gave him great access, and you even hear like the Chinese challenging the plane as it flies over one of these made-up islands that they've like created to get more ocean territory in the South China Sea, as they'll explain in this story. But if you want to know why the military gave him the access, wait till the very end of the clip, and Jim Sciutto doesn't say it's why he got the access, but I think you'll agree it's why he got the access, as I'll explain after you watch the clip here.
Tensions are rising between the U.S. and China over land grabs by the Chinese in the South China Sea. U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter, traveling in Asia, called on China to stop its expansion immediately. The U.S. is also using surveillance planes to keep an eye on what the Chinese are doing. I got rare access, the chance to ride on one on a recent trip to the region. Gentlemen, welcome aboard. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you.
My CNN team and I are the first journalists to be allowed inside the P-8 Poseidon aircraft during an operational mission. This is an enormously advanced surveillance aircraft, but it's also a weapon. It's a submarine killer. These are sonar buoys dropped into the water to track submarines, and the plane can be equipped with torpedoes to destroy those submarines. But principally today, it's a surveillance aircraft, and up in this section are the plane's eyes and its ears. It has video cameras, infrared cameras, to watch as China makes this enormous land grab in the South China Sea, creating, really manufacturing real estate on the high seas, creating islands like this one with an airstrip and a harbor. The fear of the Pentagon is that China is militarizing these islands.
We're just out here patrolling just to monitor what's going on these islands. So mostly we come out here, we look for what kind of construction activity is going on.
So the flight crew has just had its third radio contact with the Chinese military, and it was very forceful.
Foreign military aircraft. This is Chinese Navy. You are approaching our military alert zone. Leave immediately in order to avoid misjudgment.
It's very clear the Chinese military on these islands considers this their airspace and considers this U.S. aircraft, though it's in international airspace right now, as invading that airspace.
I don't ever get nervous up here. This is what I love to do. It's what we've trained to do. So when you feel prepared, I think the nerves go away.
We're just coming up now on Mischief Reef, another U.S. fears China is militarizing. The concern is that that is a potential threat, not just to commercial shipping in the area, but also U.S. naval operations. And these P-8 flights are intended in part to send a message that those are things the U.S. will not tolerate.
If China wants to intercept us in international airspace, they can do that. But they own the risk and the safety associated with that intercept.
Today, it's a standoff at a distance from a few thousand feet, from several miles, but the concern is, over time, those islands aren't going anywhere. How would this be resolved over time? Will it still be at a distance? That's a real question going forward, and neither side has figured out how to resolve that without a conflict. On his trip to Asia, Defense Secretary Carter announced a new plan, nearly $500 million towards the building of partner military capacity among allies in the Pacific.
So what do you think is that request for $500 million for military buildup in around the South China Sea the reason that the Pentagon gave Jim Sciutto the access into that P-8 Poseidon airplane, looking at the made-up islands that China's putting in the South China Sea? I don't know. This is an issue I brought up a lot when I look at what Martha Raddatz does on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. She wasn't on this week, but she is really close to the Pentagon and the military, which means that she sometimes gets to report on things that no one else gets to hear about. But on the other hand, she sometimes seems to be almost co-opted by the military and, giving their point of view on stuff. And it's whether the access is worth the co-option. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section, but I think it's an interesting question. And speaking of media co-option, I'm going to move on now to the discussion of the Patriot Act. So the Patriot Act is going to expire while I'm broadcasting here, I think it's an hour and 13 minutes left till midnight on the East Coast when the Patriot Act expires on June 1st. And from what I understand, it probably is going to expire, and then it's going to be reauthorized in just 2 or 3 days, or at least a little differently, and I'll get to that. But I want to first show some of the best coverage of this I saw, not from the shows I regularly take clips from, but this is from CNN's Reliable Sources, where Brian Stelter had an interview with Glenn Greenwald. He's now a journalist for The Intercept. At the time, he was working for The Guardian, and he's one of the journalists who got the leaks from Edward Snowden and reported on this NSA spying and the bulk phone record collection. And first I want to show this introduction from Brian Stelter, where he talks about how none of this debate we're having right now would have even happened if it hadn't been for Edward Snowden. And then he asks Glenn Greenwald to explain how Edward Snowden's revelations changed the debate, and you can see that clip over here.
The final countdown is on for a vote to keep key provisions of the Patriot Act, a controversial law that, among many other things, allows the government to collect phone metadata on ordinary Americans. The president says the U.S. needs this information to stop terrorist threats here at home. One senior administration official, given anonymity, said that Congress was playing Russian roulette with national security by not passing the extension for this bill. But there's a complication. Rand Paul is vowing to make sure the bill does not pass, and we will see what happens this afternoon. It sure looks like it's in peril. But no matter what happens, here's something to keep in mind. None of this would be happening without Edward Snowden, without his release of top secret documents, without The Guardian and the Washington Post newspapers agreeing to decipher the documents and tell the world about the NSA's programs, without journalists who stood up to the government. Some people think those journalists did a terrible thing. Some people think Snowden's a traitor. But this is a case of journalists shining a light in the darkness and affecting the public debate. Now, one of those journalists, Glenn Greenwald, is joining me now from Rio. He was one of Snowden's original contacts and now a journalist for The Intercept. Glenn, thanks for being here.
Great to be with you.
I just wanted to highlight this idea that without Snowden, we wouldn't see Rand Paul necessarily on the floor of the Senate this afternoon trying to stop this bill. Remind us where the debate was and where it was after Snowden.
Well, remember that when the Patriot Act was enacted, even in the weeks after 9/11, when the country was pretty much willing to do anything the government wanted, it was recognized it was an incredibly radical and extremist piece of legislation. And the idea was these powers we're giving the government should be temporary, not permanent. And so they're going to sunset every 5 years unless Congress renews them. And yet in 2005, the Bush administration demanded renewal, and overwhelmingly Congress renewed it with no fight. In 2011, President Obama demanded renewal, and Congress overwhelmingly renewed it without any debate. And now you see not just Rand Paul, but dozens of House liberals and House conservatives and other people standing up together and saying, we're not going to just renew the Patriot Act without reform. We're going to have serious reform. And in some cases, a lot of people are saying we should just let these provisions elapse. The whole world has changed when it comes to this debate as a result of the revelations from Edward Snowden.
Have you
So, sorry about that delay there, but yeah, that was Glenn Greenwald talking about how Edward Snowden's revelations have really changed the debate. And I was reading through the comment section while that clip was going. That's why I was a little bit delayed there. And I saw one comment from NO8549 saying, I thought it was Section 215 expiring. And I guess I wasn't completely clear about that. There are a few sections. The entire Patriot Act is not going to expire, but there are a few sections expiring, one of which is Section 215, which supposedly authorizes bulk phone record collection, although there was a Second Circuit Court of Appeals decision that said it actually doesn't justify that, and very few people mentioned that. I'm actually going to show Fox News Sunday was the only program that mentioned the Second Circuit Court of Appeals decision, but then had sort of a bogus analysis of the decision. But before I get to that, I want to show a couple more clips from Glenn Greenwald having talked about how the Edward Snowden revelations have affected the debate. Brian Stelter then asked him if he had talked to Edward Snowden and what Edward Snowden's opinion was of what was going on, and you can see the answer to that over in this clip.
Snowden. Have you been in touch with Snowden recently? How does he feel about what's about to happen in the Senate today?
I mean, he feels, very good about the fact that there's a real debate. He has serious qualms, like I think most privacy activists and advocates do, about the USA Freedom Act, which is the piece of legislation that the Obama White House and the intelligence community has gotten behind. It's woefully inadequate at best, but it's really good to see this is going to be the first time, and this is extraordinary, since 9/11, 14 years ago, that the Congress is taking away powers from the federal government in the name of terrorism rather than giving them new ones, and so hopefully this can be built on.
That's kind of a cool point that Glenn Greenwald made about this being the first time that the government is actually taking away powers since 9/11. But the most important point he made, and this is actually a point that I made in a video, a edited, produced video I uploaded during the week called Fox News Alarmism Irony Alert, where I showed a segment from the Fox News program Happening Now, where they talked about the threat from the expiration of the bulk phone record collection program, even though there's no evidence that it stopped any terrorist plots. In fact, the most there's any evidence for is that it stopped like the transfer of money from like a possible terrorist financing money transfer of like $8,000, which I'll get to a little later. But here's Glenn Greenwald talking about how the media is really irresponsible for letting unnamed sources talk about the threat from not having bulk phone record collection when there really is no threat. And I'll talk about all that a little more if you see that clip here.
When you hear news outlets, mostly citing anonymous sources, threatening about the risk to the country if these provisions do not remain, what do you hear? Because I sometimes worry that we encourage people to be more afraid than they should be by repeating these talking points from administration officials.
Well, American media outlets should really be ashamed of themselves the way they do that. I mean, supposedly the lesson that large American media outlets learned from their role in selling the Iraq war to the public was, oh, we're not going to allow government officials to propagandize the public any longer by giving them anonymity whenever they ask for it. We're going to make them put their names on things and therefore be held accountable. And yet this all turned out to be a complete scam. If you turn on any major cable network, including the one we're on, unfortunately, or read any large newspaper, American newspaper, you constantly see reporters giving anonymity to the people they're supposedly serving as watchdogs over in order to scare the public. And that New York Times article that you referenced that gave anonymity to Obama officials to say nothing other than you're playing Russian roulette with national security if you're one of our critics on the Patriot Act was disgraceful. It was the kind of reporting that got Judy Miller fired, and yet they continue to do it.
Well, and yet some officials have said it on the record. Loretta Lynch, for example, has made very severe statements about what could happen without these provisions of the Patriot Act. Are we not supposed to report what they say when they're on the record?
No, of course, on the record should absolutely be reported, and then there should be reporting that goes along with it from people who dispute that or from facts that undermine it. I mean, here's the thing, Brian, you have these Obama officials
your point is one of the quotes from her was, "We will be less safe." That was one of her quotes. I think what you're saying is there should be follow-up when, in fact, something expires and the country's not less safe.
Right. I mean, the Obama administration put together a panel to ask this panel of experts who had access to classified information, are these metadata domestic spying programs keeping us safe? And their own panel concluded that there has not been a single terrorist attack stopped by this program. So to allow Obama officials to go around the country saying you're going to die at the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda if we can't spy on you without noting that all the evidence negates that, I think is irresponsible. It's stenography journalism.
Stenography journalism, and there's a lot of truth to what Glenn Greenwald was saying there, and I'm going to show some examples, starting with the worst and then progressively a little bit better, in terms of letting viewers know that the threat from the expiration of bulk phone record collection is actually non-existent, or pretty much non-existent. And like I said, you can see me talk about that more in a video I made earlier this week called Fox News Alarmism Irony Alert, and I even give a citation to a study of all the terrorist attacks and threats against the U.S. homeland since September 11th, which basically shows that there's no evidence that this bulk phone record collection system stopped any attacks or was responsible for or necessary to stop any of the attacks. There was like one financial transfer, and you'll see Michael Hayden talk about that when I get to that clip in a minute. But first I want to show a couple clips from Bob Schieffer. I hate to criticize him on his last show. He's retiring after today's broadcast, but he was pretty much the worst in terms of assuming that expiration of this NSA spying bulk phone record collection program would be a threat to the United States. The first clip from him I'm going to show is I believe he's talking to Jeb Bush. This is another, Jeb Bush clip where he just basically tees him up on the danger from the expiration of the program and never talks about the ineffectiveness of the program at all over in this clip.
We asked him if he believes the nation's security will be in danger if the program is allowed to expire.
I do. And it's not a violation of civil liberties. There's no evidence, not a shred of evidence, that the metadata program has violated anybody's civil liberties. The first duty of our national government is to protect the homeland, and this has been an effective tool, along with many others, and the Patriot Act ought to be reauthorized, as is.
What do you think is the greatest threat to our national security right now?
So you can see the follow-up question Bob Schieffer asked there after he said it's been an effective tool is what's the greatest threat to our national security, which I'm not going to show Jeb Bush's answer, but he goes on to talk about the ISIS threat, and it basically trumps up the threat and hooks it up to this NSA spying program, even though there's no evidence that this NSA spying program has actually stopped any terrorist attacks. And another time that Bob Schieffer lost the opportunity to point out the ineffectiveness of this program is in his interview with the director of the CIA, John Brennan, and he allowed John Brennan to say it's a really effective program that stopped terrorist attacks. And his follow-up question after John Brennan said that was, basically what happens to the terror threat if we don't renew the program, without, challenging it all over in this clip.
Tools that the government has used over the last dozen years to keep this country safe are integral to making sure that we're able to stop terrorists in their tracks. The tools that we had under the Patriot Act, those ways that we are able to monitor their activities, really have helped stop attacks. These tools are all part of a package of safeguards that has been put in place. And so the President, the Attorney General, the Director of FBI, Director of National Intelligence, the heads of NSA and CIA, all are very supportive of an extension of those capabilities and those authorities. And unfortunately, I think that there's been a little bit too much political grandstanding and crusading for ideological causes that have really skewed the debate on this issue. But these tools are important to American lives.
Well, what happens if this does run out at midnight tonight? Because Senator Rand Paul, among others, says he's going to do everything he can to delay this. Let's just say they don't do anything, these authorities expire. What happens?
Well, the Bureau does not have the ability then to track these various elements that we are looking at who are trying to carry out attacks here in the homeland. Whether it is the roving wiretap, individuals who use multiple phones in order to conduct communications and to plan attacks. Whether or not it's the ability to be able to go into business records and get court orders. These are very important authorities that have not been abused by the government. These are authorities that have been used by the government to make sure that we're able to safeguard Americans. And the sad irony is that most Americans expect the government to protect them. And so although there's a lot of debate that goes on in the Congress and the Hill on this issue, I think when you go out to Boise or Tampa or Louisville, Americans are expecting their law enforcement and Homeland Security and intelligence professionals to do their work. And these authorities are important.
Do you think that terrorist elements will take advantage of this?
I think terrorist elements have watched very carefully what has happened here in the United States. Whether or not it's disclosures of classified information or whether it's changes in the law and policies, they're looking for the seams to operate within. And this is something that we can't afford to do right now, because if you look at the horrific terrorist attacks and violence that's being perpetrated around the globe, we need to keep our country safe, and our oceans are not keeping us safe the way they did a century ago.
Is there any kind of backup plan or anything that, or is there anything that will go into effect to try to make up for this while Congress is trying to decide what to do about it?
Well,
so you can see all of Bob Schieffer's follow-up questions there were about how are we going to lessen the threat, not was there actually any real threat from the expiration of this program. And that's not very good journalism, I don't think, based on what you saw Glenn Greenwald say earlier, that when officials say that there's a threat, they should be at least challenged with the facts that there really hasn't been much evidence of the threat. And like I said, best wishes to Bob Schieffer on his retirement. I hate to criticize him on his last show, but he decided to cover the news on his last show, and I don't think he did it very well in his interview with either Jeb Bush or CIA Director John Brennan when he was asking about the threat from the expiration of Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Now I'm going to move on to 5 clips from CNN's State of the Union on this. They had their guest host Jim Sciutto, and In the middle clip, you'll see he actually asks Senator Mike Lee about the ineffectiveness of the bulk phone record collection program, but almost all of his other questions kind of presume the effectiveness of the program. So that's why he's a little better than Bob Schieffer, but he also does kind of what Glenn Greenwald criticized CNN for doing, which is assuming that there's a threat from the expiration of the program. And he also, in the question he asks Utah Senator Mike Lee, Republican, Tea Party Republican, who is one of the more libertarian Republicans who's kind of responsible for this USA Freedom Act that has put a little bit of a limit on what used to be in the bulk phone record collection. But you'll see in his question to Senator Mike Lee, Jim Sciutto actually says that Section 215 authorizes bulk phone record collection, even though there's this Second Circuit Court of Appeals decision that says it actually doesn't authorize it. So it's not just expiring, it's also illegal, and I'll show that when I get to the Fox News clips in a minute, because they actually ask about that. But first, here's the first of the 5 Jim Sciutto clips doing a bad job of explaining what Section 215 authorizes, and also presuming the threat, talking to Senator Mike Lee here.
And welcome back. Just hours from now, the Senate will hold a rare Sunday session to vote on extending the Patriot Act, as well as a new domestic surveillance reform bill. At midnight tonight, 3 key provisions of the Patriot Act are set to expire. Section 215, which allows the NSA to collect and store telephone metadata on millions of Americans, the use of roving wiretaps to track terrorist suspects who frequently change their communication devices, their cell phones, and the so-called lone wolf provision, which allows the surveillance of someone who is not connected to a known terror group. But Senator and Republican presidential candidate Rand Paul is vowing to block extension of the Patriot Act and any other legislation that fails to end the government's domestic data collection program. Joining me now is Republican Senator Mike Lee. He is sponsoring the new surveillance reform bill that the Senate will take up later today, and as well Senator Angus King, who has some concerns, serious concerns, with the proposed legislation. I want to begin, if I can, with Senator Lee. Senator Lee, as we look at this legislation, we're coming down to the wire here. Do you believe you have the votes to get this passed tonight so that those powers that we just described aren't suspended?
I do believe we have the votes. And so at this point, I think the question is not really about whether we'll get this passed, but when. It'll happen either tonight or it'll happen on Wednesday or sometime in between then. But really within that 72-hour window, we are going to pass the House-passed USA Freedom Act, which passed the House with a bipartisan supermajority of 338 votes. This is a good day for the American people, whose rights will be protected, whose Fourth Amendment and privacy interests will be defended. At the same time, their national security interests will also be protected and preserved.
But
so, yeah, there's, like I said, Jim Sciutto talking to Senator Mike Lee, and he gave some important information there at the beginning that I was talking about, the 3 sections of the Patriot Act that are actually going to expire. There's the Section 215 part, there's the roving wiretaps, and the lone wolf provision. So it's not just Section 215, but it's not the entire Patriot Act. And you also heard Mike Lee give important information there at the end that what is probably going to happen, even if Rand Paul stops the Patriot Act or those sections of the Patriot Act from being renewed in 53 minutes when it expires, when I'm doing this live broadcast, even though Rand Paul may stop that from happening, probably by Wednesday, maybe even earlier, the Senate will get past all the parliamentary procedures and will pass the USA Freedom Act and renew those sections of the Patriot Act with a few more limits that I'll get to in a minute. But next I want to show Jim Sciutto. Like I said, the clip I'm going to show after this one, he talks about the possible ineffectiveness of the program. But in this one, he presumes that, oh no, there's going to be 72 hours where we don't have bulk phone record collection. How is the country going to survive? What's going to be the threat from just those 72 hours? And you'll see Mike Lee talks about that a little, and Jim Sciutto kind of reinforces it in the little comment at the end of the clip you can see here.
But 72 hours, that would still provide a window where these powers are suspended. And as the president described when he was making the case on Friday, even a short window, considering the level of the threat from groups such as ISIS, et cetera, would provide an opportunity, a danger. Are you saying that even if you have the votes, that there will be a period where these powers are suspended?
I hope not. I think that would be unfortunate, and I think it would be unnecessary. That's why I'd like to get it passed today. I will point out, I tried to bring this up early last week because I recognized that this cliff was coming. We've known for 4 years that this deadline was approaching, and I think the American people are starting to demand more. They're starting to expect that Congress actually moves ahead of the game and stops governing by cliff. The American people deserve better than this, especially when it comes to a program that's an integral part of protecting our national security.
So how did we get to this cliff? It's not a budget showdown, it's a national security showdown. How did we get here?
Well, we've known it was coming for the last 4 years. Several of us had concerns starting the last time this program was reauthorized 4 years ago. We voted against it, and we began working on a process to reform Section 215 of the Patriot Act. You know, I felt strongly about this for a long time, so much so that I devoted an entire chapter of my new book, Our Lost Constitution, to this program and to its ramifications for the Fourth Amendment and for the privacy interests of the American people. But that's why we came up with this bill. And we proposed this bill last year so that it could be introduced and passed well in advance of this deadline. Unfortunately, this sort of thing has become all too common. It's been a trend and a bad habit adopted by both parties. Bad habits, old habits, sometimes die hard, but this is an idea and a habit whose time has finally come. I think it's time for us to move forward and to stop governing by cliff.
Well, yeah, and it's a habit now that has the country's ability to counter terrorism in its sights.
The country's ability to counter terrorism is in the sights of this bad habit of Congress of putting things off to the last minute, according to Jim Sciutto's final comment there. And you can see in both those last two clips that Jim Sciutto kind of presumed that there was a threat from the expiration of this program, which makes it kind of strange that in this next clip he asked Senator Mike Lee about the evidence that there is really no terrorist plots or attacks that have been thwarted by this bulk phone record collection. And he also asked about the telecoms holding the data, and you'll see Mike Lee only responds to that second part and never really answers the question about the ineffectiveness of the program over here.
I'll ask you this finally before I let you go. When this program, the bulk metadata program, was revealed through Edward Snowden, the administration first claimed that there were some 50 terror plots that had been blocked due to that metadata collection. That number was watered down. That talking point disappeared. Senator Pat Leahy and others established that, well, in fact, it was just one plot, $8,500 going from an American to Al-Shabaab, that was directly connected to information collected in the phone metadata program. Now, the fact is, the government under this proposal won't hold the data anymore, but the phone companies will. I mean, the data is still getting collected. Why is it necessary?
Well, the phone companies will hold the records because they're the phone companies. They have a record of who calls whom. And so the NSA will be able to query and reach out to the phone companies to get that calling data that's relevant to an actual national security investigation. But we don't think it's a good idea for the government to just be collecting all this data in bulk just because it's there. This data, when aggregated and when put into a database that covers a 5-year period of time, potentially 300 million Americans, it reveals a lot about a person, about how they spend their time. And we don't think it's appropriate for the government to just collect this information simply because it exists.
Senator.
So, like I said, Senator Mike Lee didn't really answer the question there. And that's the only question where Jim Sciutto seemed to understand the fact that this bulk phone record collection program hasn't really stopped any terrorist attacks. You'll see there's a later question where he kind of presumes the threat from the expiration of the program that I'll show in a minute. This is there. I'm going to show two more clips from CNN State of the Union. The first is with Angus King, which isn't the one where he kind of presumes the threat so much, but I want to show this one because, Angus King is a senator from Maine. He's an independent, but he caucuses with the Democrats. I've kind of liked some of the things he said about NSA spying and bulk phone record collection in the past, but what he says about the USA Freedom Act and the way it allows the NSA to look into people's phone calls based on a reasonable suspicion, well, that's not probable cause, which the Fourth Amendment requires, but you'll see Senator Angus King quotes part of the Fourth Amendment that there shouldn't be unreasonable searches and seizures, but then he doesn't quote the part that says, and no warrant shall issue except on probable cause. He skips over that part, which is really important, given that he says reasonable suspicion is the level, which, probable cause is what you need to arrest someone. Reasonable suspicion is what the police need just to go up and talk to someone. It's a much lower standard. As a former criminal defense attorney, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of cases. Terry versus Ohio is the one that the Supreme Court case that said just based on a reasonable suspicion, police can go up and ask you questions and maybe even pat you down for weapons. But in order to arrest you, they have to have probable cause, more likely than not that a crime has actually occurred. Reasonable suspicion is just a reasonable suspicion based on articulable facts that criminal activity is afoot. And Angus King kind of mixes those up, talking to Jim Sciutto over in this clip.
I hear you on the point that it's not the content of phone conversations. I'm aware of that. I think many of our viewers are aware of that. But at the end of the day, it's still about who Americans are in touch with, which many would consider private information. Even if you're not listening to calls, it's who those people called. And you mentioned the Tsarnaev brothers, but can't law enforcement, if they have a suspect in mind, then track those phone conversations as opposed to collect everybody's, mine and yours included, just in case they might have to do so? That was the key privacy issue there.
And you're right, and that's exactly why I and Mike Lee and many others have supported getting this data out of the hands of the government. It just, even though there was no evidence of it ever being abused, there were protections built in. I think all of us felt, or many of us felt, that we ought to get it out of the hands of the government. But there is a step here that the government has to go through the court, the FISA court, in order to get what amounts to a warrant to have a reasonable, articulable suspicion of a terrorist connection, and then they can go and search the data. So they can't just go in and check your records to see, who you're calling in California. So there are protections. And what we're doing here, Jim, is trying to balance the fundamental responsibility that the Constitution assigns to us of national security, to provide for the common defense and ensure domestic tranquility. Those are the exact words of the preamble of the Constitution, with the Fourth Amendment and privacy rights. But the Fourth Amendment isn't absolute. It said people shall be free of unreasonable searches and seizures. We're always trying to strike the balance between those two principles in light of risks and in light of technology. And I'm strongly in favor of protecting privacy rights, but we also have to be aware that we're under threat. And it strikes me as an unusual position for Senator Paul, for example, to be talking about essentially unilaterally disarming an important national security tool at a time when I've never seen the threat level higher.
So you can see there at the end that Senator Angus King talks about getting rid of this important national security tool when the threat has never been higher. Jim Sciutto never asked Senator Angus King about the ineffectiveness of the program in preventing terrorism. Like I said, there was only that one question to Senator Mike Lee, and he never asked again. And like I said, also, Senator Angus King there mentioned the Fourth Amendment. There should be no unreasonable searches and seizures, but he didn't quote the part that said, and no warrant shall issue except on probable cause. And instead, in his answer, he talked about a reasonable suspicion being the standard to look at this phone data. That's not the probable cause standard that the Fourth Amendment says you need for a warrant. And like I said, at the end, he talked about the threat, and Jim Sciutto never mentioned the ineffectiveness. And I'm going to show one more clip from CNN's State of the Union. This is Jim Sciutto's interview with George Pataki, former governor of New York, who is another Republican who may be running for president. I didn't put him in the Republican section because I wanted to show this clip where Jim Sciutto asked him about, what about this threat from 72 hours of no bulk phone record collection? And he let George Pataki get away with talking about 9/11 since he's the former governor of New York where 9/11 occurred. He was governor during 9/11 and never really asked him about the ineffectiveness of this program in actually preventing terrorism over in this clip.
Good being on with you, Jim.
I want to start, if I can, with the news of the day because key provisions of the Patriot Act are due to expire today. We just had Senators Mike Lee and Angus King on who said it's possible, though they believe they have the votes, that these powers will be suspended, perhaps for a period of days, 2-3 days. You were governor of New York during the 9/11 attacks. Does that put the U.S. at risk of terror attack?
It certainly does, and it's just, to me, totally wrong that a filibuster would be used to create this void in our security at a time when we are at risk. And I honestly think, Jim, we're at greater risk today as we've been at any time since September 11th of another terrorist attack. So I hope they can get it done today. By the way, I think they should reauthorize the Patriot Act. I think Senator King's comments about how the alternative the House passed doesn't require the private sector to hold those phone records. And without them, we are at greater risk than we are today.
Senator Rand Paul, one of your opponents, you mentioned a filibuster there, putting the country at risk. He's the man behind it, leading the way on this. Do you believe that he's fit to be commander-in-chief in light of that position?
Well, I think he's wrong on this position where he's going to by himself block reauthorization or the creation of new authority to protect us and provide our intelligence we need to protect us in these dangerous times. So I think he's wrong. I don't understand why, if it's going to happen on Wednesday or Thursday, he doesn't allow it to happen today. It is simply putting Americans at risk for a political reason. I think it's wrong, and I think it's unfortunate.
So, yeah, their former New York Governor George Pataki got to talk about 9/11 and the threat from the expiration of this program, collecting bulk phone records, and Jim Sciutto never asked George Pataki, never asked Senator Angus King from Maine about the ineffectiveness of the program. The only question he asked about that was that one to Senator Mike Lee, which Mike Lee did not really answer. Now I want to move on to NBC's Meet the Press. The issue didn't really come up so much in the interviews on Meet the Press, at least as far as I noticed, but I want to show one more Bernie Sanders clip. I know Bernie Sanders is a favorite for many of my viewers, and this is, since Bernie Sanders is a senator, he is going to go vote on the USA Freedom Act, and he points out, he is going to vote for it, he said, but he has some problems even with what the USA Freedom Act allows, the compromise, but I'll let him explain it and then talk about it over
to Meet the Press. And let me start with an issue you're going to be dealing with in a few hours. I know you're going to be flying back from Minneapolis to Washington for this special Senate session. The NSA, the Patriot Act, Section 215. I assume you're a supporter of the USA Freedom Act. Are you? Is that where you're going to be voting?
I may well be voting for it. It doesn't go as far as I would like it to go. I voted against the original Patriot Act. I voted against the reauthorization of the Patriot Act. Look, we have got to be vigorous in fighting terrorism and protecting the American people, but we have to do it in a way that protects the constitutional rights of the American people, and I'm very, very worried about the invasion of privacy rights that we're seeing not only from the NSA and the government, but from corporate America as well. We're losing our privacy rights. It's a huge issue.
Well, and the government is going to be asking corporate America to keep this data under the USA Freedom Act. You're comfortable with that?
No, I'm not. But we have to look at the best of bad situations. The question is whether the NSA keeps it. The question is whether it is transferred to the phone companies, who, by the way, already keep records for an extended period of time.
You've served under...
So, yeah, Bernie Sanders' answer, Senator Bernie Sanders, who's now running for president against Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. I thought his answer was better than most of the ones. Senator Mike Lee's answers weren't that bad. He definitely understood the privacy concerns. That's one of the weird alliances. They're, Democrats who are ACLU liberal libertarians like me who are hooking up with people like the Tea Party. I think there's even a recent ACLU video or post or blog post about how there's this confluence of interest between leftist libertarians and Tea Party libertarians. I wish there was more of a consensus on that, but I want to move on now to how Fox News covered this. And Chris Wallace, to his credit, actually asked Michael Hayden, who was director of the NSA when this program was created under George W. Bush and through some of the Obama administration. He actually asked him about the ineffectiveness of the program, but you'll see he lets General Michael Hayden get away with saying, it's just a thread in the tapestry, and he really hypes the this one time that I mentioned that there was this one financial transaction that was thwarted by the NSA spying bulk phone record collection. Well, he talks about how that was like stopping a terrorist attack years beforehand by exposing a financier, and then the only other real answer he has to the ineffectiveness of the program is, well, I can't prove it's a silver bullet. He uses the phrase silver bullet a lot, like that really answers the question over in this clip.
To be a debate about how effective and how useful these programs are. Let me put some things on the screen. A recent report by the Justice Department's Inspector General said FBI agents could not identify any major case developments that came from bulk data collection. And the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, an independent agency created by Congress, found no instances of abuse of the program, but also no instances where it stopped a terrorist attack. Now you say, well, it's a threat, it's not the silver bullet, but that isn't exactly the good housekeeping seal of approval.
No, and when you had me in here a few months ago, Chris, and we were talking about CIA's renditions, detentions, interrogations, I had the same issue. Show me where it was a silver bullet. And I'm saying it doesn't work that way. I mean, we seem to get credit only if we get, because of one or another of these programs, we get to tackle a terrorist on the rooftop just as he's about to chamber around. How about we have a complex intelligence picture created that allows us to take action on the financier months, if not years ahead of that last-second attempt to kill us?
Okay, so the House...
So I forgot that one part where he said that to prove a silver bullet, you have to show that we took down a terrorist on a rooftop right before he loads the bullet in the chamber, which is not the standard. Like I said, if you look at my most recent video titled Fox News Alarmism Irony Alert, in like the first 30 seconds of that video, I give a link to the study of like 240 something terrorist plots since September 11th, and not one of them was thwarted. It's not a terrorist putting a round in the chamber. It's like none of those 240 plus attacks or plots was thwarted by bulk phone record collection. There was this one transfer of money by this financier that Michael Hayden kind of mentioned there, but I gave Chris Wallace a little credit for mentioning the ineffectiveness of the program, but over in this next clip, he lets Michael Hayden get away with claiming the program is totally constitutional just because this Second Circuit Court of Appeals found it was illegal. It went beyond the scope of what Section 215 of the Patriot Act allows. Section 215 of the Patriot Act says that the prosecution or the government can go and get an order from a judge, non-discretionary. All they have to do is allege a few things, and the judge has to grant the order, and it lets them get basically any tangible thing. At the time this was passed, it was called the library records provision for some reason, I remember, because it lets you get people's library records, but it lets you get any records, any tangible thing, including phone records. But what the Second Circuit Court of Appeals found was that just because it lets a prosecutor get any record doesn't mean it lets you get everybody's records for the last 5 years. Every phone call made in the United States, who it is on, which phone number called which phone number and for how long, that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals said Section 215 does not authorize that. That's illegal. And Chris Wallace, to his credit, actually asked Michael Hayden about that. But then Michael Hayden said he did the old switcheroo and said, well, because it was found illegal, that means it's not unconstitutional. And he references this 1979 Supreme Court opinion, Smith versus Maryland, which I guess I'll talk about that after I show the clip, because Chris Wallace even backs him up on it, and it's not necessarily an applicable opinion. It's much smaller in scope than what the NSA has been doing. But I'll let you see the clip, and then I'll talk about it over here.
On the other hand, does Senator Paul have a point? Because 3 weeks ago, a court of appeals ruled that the Patriot Act does not authorize this kind of bulk metadata collection, and that the specific program, is illegal.
Right. So Senator Paul claims that it's unconstitutional. Now, the controlling legal authority there is a 1979 court decision that says, indeed, metadata is not, repeat, not constitutionally protected. We have no reasonable expectation of privacy there. The second
let me just quickly explain that. What the court ruled was that if I make a call to you, perhaps the conversation between us is protected.
Absolutely.
But the fact that my number calls your number, since this would go on a phone record, which I think in that case was thrown out in the mail, and somebody could pick up, the fact that this number called that number for how many minutes, that is not constitutionally protected.
Exactly right. And so we're not talking about a constitutional matter. Now, we may be talking about a legal matter here, but Congress has the ability to resolve that. They could actually pass language that makes it quite clear that the current method of collecting metadata is indeed what Congress intends. The court held that the current language doesn't support the current activity, but Congress has it within its power and its authority to fix that.
Now, just because the Second Circuit Court of Appeals found that the program was illegal under Section 215 doesn't mean it's not unconstitutional. There's a rule that courts always look at whether something's against the statute before they reach the issue of constitutionality. So they got to the question of whether it was authorized by Section 215 first. And then that whole rigmarole about how this 1979 Supreme Court case says that there's no privacy interest in all the phone calls or all the metadata about all the phone calls made by every American in the last 5 years. That is not exactly true. This case of Smith versus Maryland was where the police put a pen register at a phone company office that collected what phone numbers were called by this one guy who then was convicted of robbery and tried to suppress the evidence in the Supreme Court. Only 5 votes for this decision. It was then 2 dissents and 2 not participating. I don't know exactly why. But Smith versus Maryland said, well, just if you do that on one person, especially because it doesn't give that much information, if you read the case, the pen register doesn't even tell you if the call was completed, unlike the NSA, which is collecting how long you talk to anyone you ever talk to. That is actually much more personal than what was in the 1979 case. So, and there were only 5 votes for it, and privacy law has changed somewhat, especially if you look at the Supreme Court decision about how cell phones have some privacy interest in the last term. Michael Hayden is not giving a very good legal opinion or explanation of the state of the law. Of course, you wouldn't expect him to, but before I leave the issue of the expiration of the Patriot Act in 28 more minutes at the time I'm broadcasting this live, I want to show a really interesting answer over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. They had former counterterrorism official in both the Bush and Obama administrations, Richard Clark, and George Stephanopoulos asked him about this, and he seemed to accept that the phone records, bulk phone records collection program was ineffective, but he talked about the other provisions that were expiring and seemed to claim that Obama was fine with the bulk phone record collection authority expiring. It was the other stuff he was worried about over in this clip.
Dramatic showdown over the Patriot Act playing out this afternoon in an emergency session of the Senate, where Rand Paul has vowed to block any effort to extend the National Security Agency's controversial collection of American phone records. That program will end at midnight if the Senate doesn't act, drawing this warning from President Obama.
and heaven forbid we've got a problem where we could have prevented a terrorist attack, but we didn't do so simply because of inaction in the Senate.
Let's bring in Richard Clark now, counterterrorism advisor to 3 presidents. Richard, thanks for joining us this morning. We just heard that warning from President Obama, but you actually served on President Obama's panel that reviewed the NSA surveillance program, essentially concluded that it wasn't necessary. So is the president being a bit alarmist here? What's really at stake?
No, what the president is saying is he's willing to give up this telephony metadata program where every call to and from information is recorded and kept by the government. He's willing to give that up because we found it did little or no value, had little or no value. But if the bill expires altogether, if the Patriot Act expires altogether, there are other investigative tools, the lone wolf authority, for example, the roving wiretap authority, that will go away as well. And that's probably going to happen tonight.
And how serious would that be?
Well, it depends on how long it goes on. What I think will happen tonight is the law will expire, and then later in the week, the USA Freedom Act, which is essentially the same as the Patriot Act, with the exception of the telephony metadata program, that act will pass and most of the authorities will be restored. So we're likely to be faced with only a few days where the FBI won't have a handful of tools that, frankly, they don't often use.
They don't use them that often.
So that was the most honest analysis of anyone, other than, of course, the Glenn Greenwald interview on Reliable Sources with Brian Stelter. It actually seemed to presume that the bulk phone record collection program was ineffective. It talked about some of these other provisions as possibly being necessary, but you saw at the end, Richard Clark admitted that they're even not used very often. So I thought that was an interesting analysis, although I'm not sure that President Obama is willing to give up the bulk phone record collection program. I think what he meant by that is that he's willing to take the limits that the USA Freedom Act puts on it, which is basically the telecoms keep the data themselves, and then the government can go and query that data, but the same metadata, although there's no requirement in the law that the telephone companies keep it or keep it for any period of time. So maybe that's going to be a little bit of a increase in privacy. And I even heard someone on Fox News in a clip I didn't take claim that it might, one of the scary things is that some phone companies might advertise themselves as not keeping your records for very long, as, you know, like all of a sudden they don't believe in the free market. But those are all the clips I want to show on the Patriot Act that expires in 24 minutes or the sections of the Patriot Act that expire in 24 minutes as I'm broadcasting this live. Before I finish the show tonight, though, I want to play you one more clip. This is a very strange story. I read the indictment in total against former Republican Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert from Illinois. He was the longest-serving Republican Speaker of the House, something like 8 years from the end of Clinton through 2006 in the George W. Bush years. And he has been indicted for structuring, which is taking out just under $10,000, which is when banks have to report it to the government that someone's taking out money, cash money. Doesn't matter if you write a check, but if you take out $10,000 or more in cash, the bank has to tell the government. And so after he took out $50,000 for a while and found out about this reporting, like he didn't know about it before, he started taking out just under $10,000, and that's actually a crime if you do it to evade the reporting. It's called structuring, and then lying to the FBI. And that's all talked about in a report on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos from ABC reporter Jim Avila in the last clip for tonight here.
He came from practically nowhere, a high school teacher and wrestling coach from a small rural district outside Chicago, to become the most powerful man in Congress. When he resigned, he seemed to disappear again, but then emerging this week in scandal. Former Speaker of the House Dennis Hastert accused of bank fraud and lying to the FBI. A longtime friend says the Illinois Republican is baffled.
There's no question he's been blackmailed, and I hope that it becomes exposed and he's vindicated.
Sources tell ABC News Hastert reportedly agreed to pay $3.5 million as hush money to a former student he allegedly sexually abused sometime during his 16-year tenure at Yorkville High School in Illinois. And sources say there is a second person who was allegedly victimized in a similar way by Hastert when he was a student. He did not ask for any hush money. But one of Hastert's former wrestling stars tells ABC News that's not the person he knew.
I stand behind him 100%, 110%, 200%. I'd be in his back pocket in Washington till the end.
Hastert attracted federal suspicion 3 years ago after making 15 separate withdrawals of $50,000 from his bank. When questioned, authorities say he started taking out smaller amounts, more than 100 withdrawals of just under the reporting limit of $10,000. Hastert told the FBI he kept the cash because he didn't think the banking system was safe. Prosecutors allege that was a lie. This week, the longest-serving Republican speaker in the history of the House, Denny Hastert, is expected to be arraigned. For This Week, Jim Avila, ABC News, Washington.
Thanks.
So, wow, if these allegations are true, then the people who impeached Bill Clinton for his affair with Monica Lewinsky include this guy, Denny Hastert, as one of the leadership, and then Newt Gingrich, who had his own affairs, of course, and then Newt Gingrich was supposed to be replaced by, what was his name, Robert Livingston, who also had to resign because of affairs. It just shows that there's a lot of self-righteousness that is undeserved by politicians. I don't know, that's somewhat of a fatuous analysis, I guess, but getting a little tired. It's started a little late, so I'm going to finish up the show here. I do appreciate the 100 or so of you who showed up to watch the program live, and I've been reading your comments along the way. And as usual, sometime later tonight, I will save all those comments from oblivion. Apparently, YouTube just deletes them, or I don't know where they go after. They just don't show up in the recorded version. So I will put them as an attached file over on my Patreon page. And by the way, I think I have about 44 patrons who are donating like $230 something per month to me. I appreciate all of you who can donate, and all of you who can't. I also appreciate those who just watch and comment and share the videos. Like I said, thanks for those of you who joined me live, and for those who watch as a recorded show. Let me know what you think about the clips I picked out. These were the best clips I could find from the Sunday morning shows. Next week, I think Bill Maher's coming back, so a little more political comedy mixed in with the serious news, to the extent you think any of that news was really serious from the corporate media. Let me know what you think of the clips, and I'll be seeing you next week. Should be on time next week, or regular time, 6:30 p.m. Pacific, which is Greenwich Mean Time minus 7 hours at this time of year, and I hope to be seeing you, and until then, I guess I'll just be seeing you all around the internet.